It's impossible to spot a psychopath merely by looking at them, and in most cases it's their behavior that reveals their true nature. Most of us know at least one psychopath, but may be unaware of the fact since they seem like a normal person, and they don't necessarily behave in a way that we would expect someone with that condition to. Number 10. When we think of psychopathy, most of us see it as a negative thing, but we rarely consider that people who've been diagnosed with that condition may use it in a constructive way, which is what World War II fighter pilot ace Chuck Yeager did. Chuck started serving in the military in 1941 after graduating from high school. He was sent to serve in the Army Air Corps, and 2 years later started flying for the 8th Air Force in England. He proved to be a most useful asset, as he managed to down 13 German aircraft during the 64 missions that he was involved in, and on one occasion found himself in trouble when he was shot down while flying over France. But he was able to make contact with individuals in the French underground, and with their help evaded capture. When his time in the military came to an end, he started a career as a flying instructor, and in 1947 became a test pilot. Following this, he was chosen to test the experimental X-1 aircraft, which was capable of reaching supersonic speeds. His role was to push the aircraft to its limits in order to find out what would happen to a pilot and the craft at such massive speeds. He became a part of aviation history on the 14th of October, 1947, when he and the X-1 were attached to a B-29 bomber and taken to a height of 25,000 feet. The craft was then released, and Chuck took it up to an altitude of 40,000 feet, and in the process, he became the first ever human to travel faster than 662 miles per hour, the speed of sound. In 1953, he pushed these limits even further and set a world record after flying at 1,650 miles per hour, this time in an X-1A rocket plane. The following year, he started flying for the 12th Air Force in West Germany, and in 1962 became a commandant at the Airspace Research Pilot School in California. There, he reached the rank of colonel and would eventually retire in 1975 as a brigadier general. By the end of his military service, he'd received several decorations and awards, including the Distinguished Service Medal, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star Medal, and the Purple Heart, to name but a few. There's no doubt that he'd earned his reputation as an outstanding pilot, a feat that many people can only dream of accomplishing. But according to scholars, Chuck may have had an advantage, as it's now believed he was a psychopath. It's been suggested that he was able to suppress the natural human fear of traveling at excessive speeds thanks to his condition, since psychopaths are known to have a diminished sense of emotion. Hence, he was able to use his psychopathy in a productive and healthy way, rather than using it to take advantage of other people, as is so often the case. Number 9. For quite some time during 2017, the 32-year-old chief executive of Turin Pharmaceuticals, a man named Martin Shkreli, was given the nickname the most hated man in America, thanks to his greed that was likely brought about by the fact that he's a psychopath. Shkreli, who worked as a hedge fund manager before breaking into the world of pharmaceuticals, used his company to acquire the rights to a type of medication called Daraprim, which was first introduced to the world in 1950. While it's used to treat toxoplasmosis, a rare parasitic infection, it's better known as the medication that's given to AIDS patients, since it helps their bodies deal with weakened immune systems. At the time, a single dose of Daraprim set patients back about $13.50. But as soon as Shkreli acquired the rights to it, he immediately raised the price to a staggering $750 per dose, and understandably, the entire world was outraged. It was a blatant display of greed at the cost of millions of people's health, and those who couldn't afford it, which was the majority, feared that they would lose their lives since their immune systems wouldn't be able to cope. The heinous deed took people by surprise, since it was known that Shkreli grew up in a working-class family, and hence knew that the average person couldn't afford to pay such a high amount for a single dose of medication. Furthermore, he knew that anyone who relied on Daraprim would soon need another dose, and that he and his company stood to make a massive profit, since the price had been increased by as much as 5,000%. He'd clearly grown accustomed to making a lot of money, since he'd worked for the Kramer Berkowitz and Company hedge fund at just 17 years old. And in the years that followed, he created and managed his own hedge fund called Elea Capital Management. In 2008, he created MSBM Capital Management, and he would use the money that he made there to break into the biotech industry. His first company in this sector was called Retrofin, which focused on medication used to treat rare diseases. But in 2014, it came to light that he'd been handling legal settlements improperly, and he was ousted from the company. He was then accused of creating the company not to treat rare diseases, but to make enough profit to pay back clients from his hedge fund company. He remained adamant that it was a conspiracy against him, and that his accusers merely wanted to take as much of his money as they could. Nevertheless, he was found guilty on 8 charges that included securities fraud. When news broke that he'd raised the price of Daraprim, he reacted aggressively, and in response started quoting lyrics from rap songs by artists such as Eminem, stating that since the media was pointing the finger at him, he was pointing one right back. He made appearances on several TV shows, claiming that the ridiculous price increase was justified by the fact that it was a highly specialized type of medication, and he reminded the public that Aston Martin vehicles used to be sold at the same price as a bicycle, a statement that drew only more criticism. Those who saw the interviews on TV described him as cold, unfeeling, and malicious, since he seemed to have no remorse for what he had done, and could be seen smirking when he was asked certain questions. He was eventually forced to drastically cut the price of the medication, and lamented at the fact that his company would only be making a small profit. Today, he's employed as a software developer and a consultant for the law office of Christopher K. Johnston. Number 8. Al Dunlap is considered to be one of the worst people to work for in the whole world, and he's been described as a corporate psychopath who will stop at nothing to turn a profit, even if it means that his company's employees are made to suffer as a result. Those who knew him described him as having an inflated sense of self-worth, a manipulator, and a greedmonger. He was born in New Jersey in 1937, and grew up in a very comfortable family environment. But to garner sympathy from those around him, he used to claim that he was the son of a Woolworths clerk, and that for most of his childhood, he was deprived of even the most basic essentials. His sister would later set the record straight, revealing that their father was a boilermaker who helped build powerful plants, and that their mother took care of them at home. In other words, his father had a steady, well-paying job, and his mother was always around to look after Dunlap and his sister. She added that they were actually very well off compared to other families in the area. As a teenager, he developed a bad temper, and this was a trait that remained with him for the rest of his life. While serving in the military, he met his wife, Gwen Donnelly, who would reveal years later that his temper had become a huge problem in their marriage, since he would often become physically and mentally abusive. He was known to fly off the handle if he found a single spot of dust in their house, and when she revealed that she was pregnant, he became extremely angry, telling Gwen that he was planning to divorce her so that he wouldn't have to look after the child, who he referred to as a brat. He threatened to end her life on several occasions, and in 1964 she decided to file for divorce. At the divorce proceedings, he was described by the judge as extremely cruel, and she was finally free to leave with their son, who was 2 years old by now. By this time, he'd stopped speaking to the rest of his family, and whenever he was notified of a loved one's passing, he would make excuses, saying he was too busy to attend their funerals. Eventually, his aged mother needed aid and care, and when asked if he would help his sister when needed, he refused outright. He became known as Chainsaw Al, thanks to his grating management style, and the fact that he was in the habit of firing most of the company's employees as soon as he was employed as CEO. When he was employed by Sunbeam Corporation, he immediately fired half the workforce, closed several of their factories, and started instilling a sense of fear in anyone who he did not get rid of. He bullied and berated anyone he came across and would not tolerate anyone who disagreed with his policies. He created a facade of confidence and intellect, but his true nature would soon be revealed for all to see. While Sunbeam was now making a profit, it soon came to light that this was only true on the surface, since Dunlap had been using accounting tricks to create this illusion. When all was said and done, the company was ruined, and its shareholders had lost all their money. Dunlap was fired, and the company filed for bankruptcy. Dunlap was sued by Sunbeam's shareholders after accusing him of fraud, and while he maintained that he was never at fault, he was eventually ordered to repay $15 million in restitution. Number 7. The life of the famous explorer, Christopher Columbus, is one that reads like an oxymoron. On one hand, he's hailed as one of the greatest explorers of all time, but on the other, he's described as a capitalist and enslaver who would stop at nothing to further his fame, wealth, and career. For a very long time, he was credited as the discoverer of America, but we now know that he only happened upon the Bahamas, specifically an island that he named San Salvador, completely by accident, and that America was actually discovered by the Norse about 500 years before he ever set foot there. Many historians now describe him as one of the worst tyrants in all known history, and yet the US continues to celebrate Columbus Day every year on the 12th of October, the day that he arrived in the Americas, and hence calls have been made for the tradition to be brought to an end. On one occasion, after surviving an attack by 2,000 Native American warriors, he told one of his subordinates to invite 3 of their leaders to attend a meeting. Once they arrived, he had them publicly executed. He then asked a Native American man to accompany him and his crew on their voyage, but the man likely knew that he would serve as nothing more than a slave and he refused. As a result, Columbus ordered that his ears be removed. He allowed his crew to kidnap women from their home countries, never to be returned, and instituted a policy whereby every Native American over the age of 14 had to excavate for gold, and if they refused, they were to be executed. Needless to say that the gold that was found made its way into his coffers, and the natives never profited from any of it. He then ordered that 1,500 people be taken as slaves, and they were sent to slave camps. Some of these people were born in these camps and lived in horrendous conditions their whole lives, eventually passing away there. At one point, Native American tribes became so fed up with his greed and cruelty that they started burning their own crops, choosing to starve rather than let Columbus get his hands on their food. Others were unable to grow crops since they were too busy excavating gold in fear for their lives, leading to further starvation. But his cruelty didn't end with the Native American people, as Spanish settlers who'd relocated to America soon learned of his cruelty. When they dared use some of the gold that had been found to buy food, they were tied up and mercilessly assaulted, despite the fact that they were close to losing their lives due to starvation. If they dared use words that he deemed to be disrespectful, he would have their tongues removed. Spanish settlers who stole bread to survive were summarily executed, and on one occasion a woman was badly beaten by his orders, as he believed she was lying about being pregnant. Just 5 years after he arrived in the Americas, the 300,000-strong Native American population had declined to just 500. Hence, it's completely understandable that a call has been made for Columbus Day to be changed to the day of celebration for the Native American people, rather than remembering a man who showed destruction and fear wherever he went. Number 6. If Hollywood movies are anything to go by, just about every pirate in history would be considered a psychopath. But in reality, most pirates were normal seafaring people who decided to adopt a life of crime. But this cannot be said about Francois Lon, who carried out his piracy in the Caribbean during the 1600s. And to this day, his reputation has marked him as a despicable man who cared very little for anyone with whom he crossed paths. Lon was born sometime between 1630 and 1635 in France, and was originally named Jean David. He decided to follow a life of piracy when he was just 20 years old, and this choice led him to the Caribbean. But once there, he first started working on a plantation, where he remained for 3 years. He then joined up with a group of hunters that were known as the Buccaneers. The Spanish government wasn't very fond of the Buccaneers, and repeatedly attempted to arrest them. But these skilled hunters would simply retreat into the woods, expertly avoiding capture. Before long, many of the Buccaneers decided to turn to piracy, and one of them was Lon. Most of the Buccaneers then traveled to the island of Tortuga, where they were free to do as they pleased, since the French authorities chose to turn a blind eye to everything that was going on in that area. This was mostly because invading Spanish ships rarely traveled near Tortuga, for fear that they'd be beset upon by pirates. Lolone enjoyed life on the island so much that he decided to make it his headquarters, from where he could carry out his heinous deeds. A governor gifted him a ship that had been captured, and he was told that if he were to attack Spanish ships during his travels, no one would bat an eye. It didn't take long before he became known as the cruelest of all the buccaneers, since he refused to take prisoners when raiding his ship, and chose to rather end all of his enemies' lives. He became well known for destroying Spanish ships, and was given the moniker the Flail of the Spanish. But his cruel nature had an effect on his enemies that he could never have foreseen, as they'd heard of his methods and decided that they no longer wanted to surrender to him, but rather fight even harder to stay alive. On one occasion, his ship was wrecked on the coast of Mexico, and a group of men from an indigenous tribe took the opportunity to launch an attack against him and his men. Lolone pretended to have lost his life and hid himself among his fellow crew members before making his escape. He somehow managed to acquire a canoe and made it all the way back to Tortuga unharmed. He then took over a Spanish warship after ending the lives of the entire crew except for one man, who he sent back to the Spanish governor with the message that he would continue to attack Spanish ships and that he would show their crews no mercy. For many more years, he wreaked havoc in the Caribbean, pillaging, stealing, kidnapping people for ransom, and becoming ever wealthier. He spent most of his money on wine and women, and when he ran out of funds, he merely took to the seas to acquire more. This led to his downfall, as he and 700 men aboard 6 ships decided to invade Honduras. When they reached the settlement of Puerto Caballos, the locals fled, and the crew searched for valuables but found none. He then set sail once more and managed to take over a Spanish galleon, but he and his crew didn't know how to control such a large vessel, and they ran aground on the Nicaraguan coast. The group was attacked by Spanish soldiers, and Lolone managed to escape, but was then captured by a tribe of cannibals and finally met his end, bringing his days of cruelty to a close. Number 5. Edward Lowe is yet another pirate who in modern times is considered to have been a psychopath. Since the condition had not been discovered at the time when he was alive, which was from 1690 to 1724, he was at the time known as a notorious maniac. Lowe's life of crime started at an early age, as he was known to steal just about anything that he could get his hands on while growing up in London. He first set sail on the seas in 1714 when he traveled to Honduras, and there he started working an honest job as a woodcutter. But he was far from fond of manual labor, and before long he and a few men he'd met decided to try their hands at something less honest, and they ended the life of their captain. But Lowe's shot missed, and he was exiled along with his co-conspirators. They were left adrift on a small rowboat, and Lowe immediately took charge. They hailed a passing ship, and when they were brought aboard, they overpowered the crew and took it as their own. They had now become pirates and would enjoy that life for some time to come. In 1723, he pulled off one of his most famous heists when he and his crew set upon 13 fishing vessels in Port Roseway, though to be fair, they didn't put up much of a fight since they were worried about what would be done to them if they resisted. He took control of an 80-ton ship named Fancy, and his reputation as a pirate started to spread. He was now becoming known on the open seas, but as is often the case, his psychotic nature drove him too far. While he had a policy that women and children should never be harmed, the men that he captured were subjected to cruel and inhumane treatments before their lives were ended, and before long, his hubris led to his demise. On the 10th of June, 1723, Lowe was being hunted by the crew of the HMS Greyhound, a 29-cannon English warship. They were discovered, and Lowe's ship was destroyed, but he and a few of his men somehow managed to flee. He was outraged at being defeated and took his temper out on his remaining men, but they'd had enough of his cruelty and conspired to mutiny, leaving Lowe marooned on a nearby island. Nothing more is known about him, and it's believed that he either succumbed on the island or was discovered there by the French, who then ended his life as he had done to so many men during his lifetime. Number 4. Tom Scill was also known by the nickname the Blind Soldier Poet. He served in the Australian military during World War I and quickly gained a reputation for bravery since he was given the role of a flag signaler, which was one of the most dangerous jobs during wartime back then. He's now widely considered to have been a psychopath, but one would never have guessed this during his formative years. Scill was born in Terang, Victoria in Australia to two Irish immigrants. He attended school at St. Mary's Convent in Hamilton and started working at the age of 14, first as a telegraph messenger and then as a telephonist. He was very eloquent in his speech and enjoyed his role at the Hibernian Society's debate club. In 1914, he enlisted in the Australian military and was sent to Anzac Cove the following year, where he commenced his signaling duties. Just 2 weeks after arriving there, he had the misfortune of having a Turkish shell explode close to him and he lost his sight. Due to his injury, he was sent back to Melbourne and then Hamilton, where he was greeted as a war hero. He didn't let his blindness get the better of him and continued to write poetry, and recited some of his work at the Tivoli Theatre in Melbourne in November of 1915. He soon became a well-known poet, and in just 4 months had sold 20,000 copies of his book, Soldier Songs from Anzac. Hence, he became known as the Blind Soldier Poet, and thanks to his popularity, he embarked on a tour of Australia, raising funds for the Red Cross along the way. He gave several lectures, made appearances on recruitment platforms, and was eventually discharged from the military in 1916. He then traveled to North America, where he started giving lectures, and his popularity only grew. He was hailed by Theodore Roosevelt as the finest soldier speaker in the world. In 1918, he traveled to Washington, where he underwent osteopathic treatment, and his sight was partially restored. He was then appointed as a war lecturer with the U.S. military, and after claiming he'd been rejected by the British military, he traveled to several war-torn areas before returning to the U.S. to continue lecturing. He eventually lost his life during an air accident in Massachusetts in 1932, and was remembered as a brave soldier who was wounded during battle, but refused to let his misfortune get the better of him. Or so everyone thought. It was later revealed by biographer Jeff Brownrigg that Scill never actually lost his sight, but faked the injury to shorten his time in the military. It's the type of deception often associated with psychopaths, and he then used the sympathy that he garnered to forge a career as a famous poet, continuing to deceive everyone around him for many years after the fact. Number 3. Most psychopaths try to hide the fact that they've been diagnosed with the condition since they might be looked upon by those close to them as dangerous or unstable. The fact is, though, that not all psychopaths become violent or unpredictable, as they're able to manage their condition properly. One example of this is a man named James Fallon. In 2005, he was working at UC Irvine as a neuroscientist, and he, with the aid of a technician, was studying a set of x-rays that had been taken of the brains of people who were known to suffer from Alzheimer's disease. He'd also taken x-rays of his healthy family members' brains to use as a control, while simultaneously looking at fMRI scans of known violent psychopaths in a side project that he had undertaken. But then he stumbled across something that he thought had to be a mistake. One of the control x-rays showed that a scan in his family's pile showed the same characteristics as the brains belonging to psychopaths, and he instructed the technician to sort the scans into their proper piles. But the technician assured him that each pile was correctly organized, and upon closer inspection, he found that the scan in question was, in fact, his own brain. He now learned he was a psychopath. The discovery took him by surprise, and he was determined to find out how this was possible. He started looking into his family's past, poring over his family tree, and talking to experts about the condition in an effort to understand it better. He questioned his friends and family, asking about his behavior from their point of view, hoping to learn whether or not he behaved like a psychopath. To his surprise, many of his loved ones stated they were not surprised to learn he was a psychopath, despite the fact that he'd never acted violently towards any of them. He then started pondering why he remained more docile than other psychopaths, and started writing about nature versus nurture. He'd always believed that these types of conditions were hereditary, but he now started considering the possibility that one's upbringing might be a contributing factor, and that genetics might not play as big of a role as he had first imagined. Only while speaking to his mother did he learn that he was considered a weird child during his youth. And he recalled that on several occasions while still young, people told him that he'd grow up to be a gangster or the leader of an organized crime syndicate. He remembered that some children were forbidden from socializing with him, and he was then told that many people from his past were surprised that he never spent any time in prison. He asked his family why they'd never confronted him about his behavior, to which they replied that they had, but he chose to ignore them, since he believed they were calling him crazy when they were actually pointing out that he was a psychopath. Experts told him that had his childhood not been as good as it was, he likely would have given in to his psychopathic behavior and possibly become violent. This might have resulted in him being sent to prison or even losing his life. But since he was raised in a stable environment, his condition remained more docile than usual. When asked by his family how he felt about learning about his condition, he replied that he didn't care, which confirmed that he lacked the sense of horror that most of us would feel if we were diagnosed with a similar condition. Number 2. The soldier and author, Andy McNab, was diagnosed as a psychopath in 2010, but he's revealed that there were signs of his condition while he was fighting in the First Gulf War, and that he should have caught on that something wasn't right long before he was assessed by doctors. McNab is best known for commanding the Bravo 20 patrol during the war, and he stated that at the time, he could end someone's life without feeling an ounce of remorse and would carry on with his day as if nothing happened. He also revealed that while he was out in the field, he would see the missions that he was given as games. He had to eliminate a target. He would consider what their lives were worth in cash, and he believed that he should receive at least 10% of that amount for the work he'd carried out. Furthermore, once the target was destroyed, he and his men would need to find a way to escape, and this only added to the thrill of the game as he saw it. When asked whether he ever considered the moral implications of ending someone's life, he stated it never crossed his mind, since the part of the brain associated with empathy is non-functioning in psychopaths. When considering whether to accept a mission, he always looked at the details of the first job, and only accepted it when the pay was high enough and the mission was interesting enough. He believes it's likely his psychopathy that presented itself early on in his life, thanks to his rough upbringing. Immediately after he was born, he was abandoned and left at Guy's Hospital in London after being placed in a grocery bag. As an adult, he joined the British military and in 1991 was appointed as the leader of the Bravo 20 squad. The group was dropped behind many Iraqi enemy lines after being told that they were expected to destroy as many lines of communication in the area as possible. But his squad was intercepted, and 3 of his men lost their lives, but he was captured and subjected to terrible treatment, and he believes he was able to survive thanks to the fact that he's a psychopath, though he didn't know it at the time. When he returned home after the war and found out he was a psychopath, he realized that many of the events in his life suddenly made sense. He was always overly motivated to achieve any goal that he set for himself, and proved more resilient than most soldiers in combat situations. He then wrote a memoir called Bravo 20, in which he outlined his time as part of the SAS patrol, and how his condition aided him during this time, but it's only served to further highlight his psychopathic tendencies. As soon as the book was released, fellow soldiers came forward to state that the events he recounted were mostly fabrications. He claims that the group ended the lives of a large number of enemies, but this has been challenged by many of his peers, since no evidence has ever been found that this was the case. Former SAS reservist Michael Asher has called McNab's version of events during his time in Iraq completely fraudulent, and suggests that he hides his face from the public for this very reason, since he knows he's being deceitful. Number 1. Robert Franklin Straoud is best known by his nickname the Birdman of Alcatraz, and has been hailed by the New York Times as America's most famous convict. But he was just another prisoner until 1955, when a former corrections officer named Thomas E. Gaddis decided to write a book about Straoud, which was entitled The Birdman of Alcatraz. The book was eventually made into a movie, in which Straoud's character was portrayed by Burt Lancaster. The film took the world by storm and won 4 Academy Awards. In the book, Gaddis paints Straoud as a lonely inmate who's sent to solitary confinement after ending the life of a prison guard while he's incarcerated. There, he fights off his solitude by caring for a sick bird and eventually nurses it back to health. He then takes a marked interest in birds and becomes an ornithologist, eventually authoring a book about diseases that affect birds. But when he's relocated to Alcatraz, his marriage falls into jeopardy. Thanks to the portrayal of his character in the book and in the film, Straoud found his way into the hearts of the public, who believed he was a mild-mannered man who loved caring for birds, and he was sent to prison for making one mistake in his life. But this is far from the truth. One guard who got to know Straoud while he was in prison stated that he's far from the sweet, innocent man that's seen in the tale of his life. Instead, he claims that he was a vicious man who relished in anything chaotic and wouldn't think twice about ending someone's life. When Straoud was evaluated by a psychiatrist in 1942, he was found to be psychotic and very intellectual. It's also known that his father was a violent alcoholic who would often aim his rage at his children. As an adult, he moved to Juneau in Alaska, and it's there that his psychotic nature would reveal itself. On one occasion, he got into an argument with a bartender named Charlie Van Dahmer over an unknown issue, and he ended his life with a firearm before handing himself over to the police. He managed to avoid execution by pleading guilty to manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 12 years behind bars. But while incarcerated, he became ever more violent, and on one occasion attempted to end the life of a fellow inmate who'd revealed to guards that Straoud had been stealing food. In 1915, he was diagnosed with Bright's disease, which had started affecting his kidneys. He nearly lost his life to the condition, but was able to pull through. But the pain remained with him for the rest of his life, and it's thought that it only exacerbated his psychotic nature. The following year, he attacked and ended the life of a guard in the prison's mess hall. While accounts of the event are unclear, it's believed that Straoud became enraged after being denied a visit from his brother, and he attacked the guard who reported his behavior. He was eventually transferred to Alcatraz, and contrary to popular belief, he never took care of any birds while incarcerated there. He would eventually pass away of natural causes in 1963 at the age of 73, after spending 17 years in Alcatraz. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.